Hello and welcome back to The Path, the podcast from Lifestyle RX. Joining me, as always, is Dr. Brendan Byrne. How are you doing today?
Hey, Dan. I'm doing great.
Excellent. Okay, so in this episode is another episode on CGMs. So today we actually have some case studies. So some patients from our patient community have graciously allowed us to use their data anonymously. And Brendan is going to go through their data and kind of explain what it looks like so everyone has a better idea on how to use CGMs. So with that, I will let you take over there, Brendan, and get into it.
All right. So great. This is definitely going to be a podcast episode that you want to watch the YouTube for. I was going to say, I'll try to describe things as well as I can. But we've got 3 case studies that are going to give you a sense of some of the extra information that you can get from CGM reports. All right, so let's begin with case number 1. So this is a 76-year-old woman who is on metformin. And if we were going to subtype her, we'd put her into subtype 5, really age-related type 2 diabetes. So what you see here is she's got moderate insulin resistance, but a pancreas that's not really responding very well. Now, that doesn't mean that she can't do well in the program. She actually did really quite well. So this CGM is taken midway through the program. So we can kind of see that along the way, she definitely improved. But let's have a look at her CGM report. So the first thing that we see is essentially there's a bunch of information in this report, and I've taken little shots of it to go through some of the things that I'll look at. So one thing I look at right away is kind of how much time was the sensor active. And so with Freestyle Libre 2, remember, you've got to touch the sensor at least every 8 hours or you get gaps. So here we've got kind of 83%. So there's still about 17% missing, but I think it's actually still pretty representative. The next thing I look for is the glucose variability. And ideally what you want to see here is kind of the lower number, the better. If you're above 30%, it just means that, the glucose is bouncing all over the place. So we want to kind of see lower here. And this is something that generally in most of our type 2s, we'll see kind of a lower percentage unless you're really, really spiking on blood sugars. And generally kind of after week 2 or 3 of the program, that you're not going to get those big spikes anymore. The next thing I start to look at is the time and range. And so we talked about this on the previous podcast around CGM. There is a range that comes, kind of default built into with the Freestyle Libre of 3.9 to 10. And this time and range is actually a really interesting concept. So if you haven't kind of listened to that first podcast, go back to that one and do review it. So what we see here is that about 82% of the time, this patient is in range, but no lows, which is great. And we wouldn't really expect any lows because she's only on metformin, but she's got some highs. And so let's go a little bit further into this. About 17% of the time, or kind of 4 hours out of the time that we're measuring, 4 hours out of the day, she's high. And so what we see here is really kind of a classic pattern for somebody who's actually got pretty good control from the perspective of fasting blood sugar. And again, she has moderate insulin resistance, but actually it's pretty good control. It's pretty flat until the morning. And then with breakfast, it goes up and then it stays up, right? So it kind of initial spike in the morning, get kind of a bit of a range with that. But then it kind of stays up and goes up again in the evening. Now, I don't really see a lunchtime spike, so not sure whether there's, lunch is occurring or not. The thing to look at kind of in this graph that I think is really helpful is, so this is taking kind of all the readings from the 14 days and superimposing them onto one image. So that, you kind of see the line in the middle is really kind of the average, but you start to see the variation. So there's not much variation during fasting, but obviously with meals, just because of different types of meals and a little bit different timing of meals, you'll get kind of you'll see that variation increase, so that the 95% band is spread out over quite a distance. Anywhere kind of, if we look at it about 10 in the morning, it's anywhere from somewhere 6 or 7 to 14, right? So that's
Mhm.
a pretty big range. So this is kind of interesting, and when we look at it from this other view pattern, we also get the same thing. You see where all the highs are occurring, right? And so two things I think are happening here for this patient. One is just really kind of the spiking with the meals. So there's definitely improvements we can do upon the meals, but the second is really kind of what's happening afterwards. Oops, sorry. Let me let me touch base a little bit more on that. So, I did mention that we think we would classify this patient as age-related type 2 diabetes, right? So, one of the things I've said with age-related type 2 diabetes, we think that what's happening is the muscles really are probably playing a more significant role. So
Mhm.
pancreas isn't super responsive, that's for sure. But the muscles also aren't taking up that glucose. And you kind of just see this. It's just, from the time that the fast is broken until we kind of get into that post-absorptive phase, that as soon as food comes in, the glucose kind of sits in the blood. It has a hard time getting taken up by the muscle.
Mhm.
So this is a really good case, in terms of where we go from here for this person. So she's actually done really well in the program, but I think more exercise and better muscle health over time. What we're going to see is that the glucose coming down between meals a little bit more, and then maybe the spike not going quite as high.
Cool.
Any thoughts from that, Dan? That anything I missed with that case?
No, I don't think so. I think that's it's super cool to see the I think we talk about the dawn effect all the time, and I think you can definitely see that in this one, right? You can see when right in the morning there it kind of goes up, and I'm sure that's when they break their fast and stuff too. So it's cool to be able
Yeah.
to see the stuff we talk about in the data.
Yeah, actually, I mean, if we look at it, this is actually really probably not the dawn effect, but the
Hmm.
breakfast effect. Um,
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah.
yeah, the dawn effect's a little bit earlier, like unless because we're not seeing that rise where we expect to, unless she
Hmm.
shifted, and that's a good point. She could be somebody that's a little bit shifted in terms of their dawn effect,
Hmm.
but yeah, I think it's probably more just a breakfast
That's the
effect.
breakfast there. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Um,
Cool. So would that be a good thing then if that was indeed the breakfast effect, that not seeing a spike from before, is that good, or is that something that you
Yeah, I think it actually is good,
Mhm.
right? And I think that speaks to kind of why her blood sugars kind of overall control is actually pretty
Mm.
good. So if you look at this curve came, I think, when her A1C. So originally she was at 7.2, and then she's brought it down below 6.5%. So I think this was kind of later on with that.
Mm.
And you kind of look, it's like she's really good from midnight till that 9 a.m. Really perfect sugars,
Yeah.
and then in range most of the day, but at the high part of the range, and then just kind of being pushed over with each meal. So yeah, this is I thought this was kind of a cool case because it really kind of drives home. Yeah, there's a lot that we can do with nutrition. We can reverse insulin resistance,
Mhm.
all of that. But muscles ultimately are going to play a big role here.
And then in this one, you're kind of seeing like there's obviously there's two spikes. So you think that's because maybe they don't eat whatever they eat for lunch is kind of not causing as much of a spike. Maybe they aren't eating lunch. What do you think is you think you'd expect to see three right from three?
Yeah, my suspicion is this person's not eating lunch.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what we're seeing here. Either that, or they're snacking in between, and so they're not
Mm.
really getting a huge
A huge
right.
spike.
You
Yeah.
see, I mean, you see a couple of little points here
Yeah.
in the day, but yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
Cool.
That's my suspicion with with this. I don't have all the information
Yeah,
behind it.
definitely. Yeah, but it's really interesting to see what you can see with the results that you get.
Yeah, and the visualizations that that Abbott has in the Freestyle Libre, like they keep getting better. Like this is better
Hmm.
than it was a year ago, and I particularly like this view. I think it just with the data points, it kind of really gives you some extra information. And in the individual reports, if you keep track, I mean, it's a lot of work to kind of track your meals as you go through it. But if
For
you keep
sure.
track in their app, you can actually in your reports see exactly what meal did what.
Hmm. Cool. Cool.
All right,
Awesome.
let's jump to case number two. This one's a 70-year-old man who's on metformin and glucoside. And really, if we were going to subtype him, we'd probably say really subtype 2, pancreatic deficiency, not LADA, not the autoimmune type, but just really deficient pancreas. There is some moderate insulin resistance, but really the pancreas is just not responding all that well. And when we again kind of go through here, we see a little bit higher variability than kind of the first case. So bouncing around a little bit more, but still under 30%. So not extreme or anything like that. The lows, kind of 1% in the lows. Now we're more interested in the lows now for this patient because they're on a medication that could actually lead to lows. So the glucoside could give you some clinical lows. So, whenever somebody's on glucoside or insulin, we take those lows really seriously.
Mm.
Um, when we look kind of target time and range, again, around, this person's a little bit higher, 92% in range, and about 7% kind of above range, kind of in the high, not very high, but 10 to 13. And again, kind of what we see here is kind of a different pattern, right? So this one's really quite interesting because during the daytime, it's pretty good, right? Like
Mhm.
you barely, you can kind of sense there's a little bit of something happening around, kind of 9 or 10 a.m. Again, kind of something mid-afternoon, something around dinner. So you can kind of sense where the meals are coming, but overall the variation on the baseline is actually not tremendous. But there's a lot of variation in the middle of the night, and so that one's kind of interesting. And you see it here. You see where the highs are coming. They're coming at times when this person's not eating, right?
Interesting.
And so kind of an unusual pattern that we're seeing here. And then a lot of variability, right? Because sometimes we're seeing the lows, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes we're seeing high at the very same time. And so it makes you wonder kind of what's going on overnight. And this is where, having more information. So this is this person's sleep questionnaire. And what we see is, trouble staying asleep every day, right? Every night, nighttime urination more than once. And then when we look at the person's medications, you can also tell sleep's a big issue, right? Taking some Zopiclone, taking some CBD, also taking some melatonin, really struggling with sleep. And so, this is really kind of another example just of kind of the role that if you're getting up and not sleeping, it can play havoc on that overnight glucose curve. You often get a real rise in cortisol when you don't sleep. And then cortisol generates that, essentially it's the same as the stress response. So it mobilizes glucose. So this one, again, we see a lot of information from that. So really, these curves, CGM, we're so often thinking about it purely in terms of, how to regulate your carbohydrate intake. But here's one where, the follow-up really needs to be around sleep and
Mhm.
looking at this and saying, okay, what's happening at nighttime, and is this something that can be addressed? And so it's digging a little bit deeper on that.
And this is one of those ones where, we have some people that, I've made all the changes. I'm eating right, I'm exercising, I'm doing everything I think properly, and I'm still like my A1C is still a bit higher than it should be.
Right.
This is probably one of those times where you put a CGM on, you see that happening at night, like, oh, that's like it looks like they're eating probably pretty well, right? They're not seeing spikes from the meal times. This would be one of those where you might not even know that was happening at night, right?
Exactly. And depending how long this has been going on for, that little bit of insulin resistance we're seeing may be driven by this kind of cortisol effect overnight.
Interesting. Yeah.
Our third case is a 62-year-old woman, again on metformin and glyburide, so again on a sulfonylurea. And if we were going to subtype, we'd say subtype 3 weight-related type 2 diabetes. So we're seeing some insulin resistance. Pancreas is doing okay, and overall the balance is, her A1C is not too bad. And so when we kind of look here, we kind of go through kind of the process of reviewing it. So, sorry, we see that the variability is, again, not super high, 20%, but not really low, right? Not as low as we would ultimately like to see it. No lows, so that's good, right? So she's not, that glyburide's not having kind of any adverse effect. Time in range, though, only 76%. So we're not really happy with that, and spending, almost a quarter of her time kind of high, or a little, very little bit of time very high. And so again, kind of looking at this range, really what we see here is again kind of the pattern of once she's starting to eat. So here you see a little bit more of that dawn effect. So you kind of see around 5 or 6, it starts to climb. But then that feeds kind of right into kind of where she's eating, and you see the big variability there. And again, another kind of little bump here, kind of, for lunch, another bump at dinner. And so here we're kind of seeing, definitely, if we can get better control, we can reduce the variability here. But even kind of at the, we'd have to kind of get to her best control to get it kind of down below and back in range. So nutrition is going to tighten this up a fair bit. Whoops, sorry. So nutrition is going to tighten this up a fair bit, but the underlying insulin resistance is actually the problem, because you just look at kind of the fasting blood sugar kind of in the morning it's actually kind of high, right? It's already kind of high up in the zone.
Yeah.
Therefore, there's just not much room once you start to eat to see things kind of pile on top of that. So again, kind of here, it's a little bit, let's look at kind of individual meals and see kind of what we can do to decrease any spiking from those individual meals. So that's kind of a first thing we can manage. Let's manage that nutrition quality and the fasting and the exercise, kind of everything we talk about in the foundation phase, to get to a place where we start to see weight come off. And then what we'd expect is over time this is going to improve, right? And so you can get rid of these kind of jagged spikes quickly by changing the meals, but that baseline blood sugar is going to be much more driven by the fat that's in the liver, and it's just going to take that weight reduction to see that improvement. So for somebody like this, this curve gives me some feedback that definitely some room still to improve on meals. If we got another curve that was kind of a little bit flatter, and not as much variability around the meal times, then we would say, okay, we probably don't need a glucose monitor for a few months. Let's see what it's like after we get some more weight off.
Sure.
And again, you really see it kind of here as well. It's kind of, once we get into the meal phase of the day, pretty much quite a lot of highs there. Some of those are obviously going to be related to the meals, but it's also just related to that baseline is so high.
And it's interesting there, you see those like very highs seem to be clustered more in the morning as opposed to like maybe the evening when you might expect them with like the bigger meal, right? What do you think could cause that?
Yeah. So oops, sorry. What I think's happening there is just really coming into the morning with a pretty high fasting glucose. And so anything that she's having is just going to pile on top of that, right? There's already too much glucose in the blood, and then anything. So we definitely kind of want to focus on that meal quality of that first meal, and at least get those those real high ones away. I think those ones are really going to be nutritionally driven. but you can kind of see where the overall average is. She's still going to be high, right?
Yeah.
And that's probably not going to go away until later. The other thing that wanted to draw attention with here is again, because we kind of dig a little bit deeper, because we're just not seeing the reduction in glucose either. And we saw that kind of in that first case, and you see it again here. And here we really see kind of on exercise. So the exercise is really poor. So again, I think what I would like to see is if we just kind of get some exercise, especially midday exercise, or if you could get kind of a walk after meals, that would really help bring the sugars down during the day and make the muscles more responsive to absorbing that glucose.
Cool.
Yeah. So, when we look at these curves, what we're trying to do is get feedback on various parts of the model as we talked about, right? So there's what's happening with our glucose when we're fasting. What happens to our glucose when we eat? What happens to glucose when, if we have sleep disturbances? What happens to our glucose if we're exercising or if we're not exercising? And those are the things that we start to just get a better understanding on that personal level for people by using the tool.
Yeah, definitely. It's amazing how much data actually comes out of like even a relatively simple tool as we might think, but like the amount of stuff that you can actually the cool graphs it makes and everything. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's I think honestly, I don't think people get as much out of it as they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I even know that from, I will do reviews with people and we'll look at their curves. But honestly, even in a 10-minute visit, I'll look at these highlights. There's more there, especially if you're able to go back in time and start to look at changes in progression.
For sure. Yeah.
So it is something that I'm really excited about this data, and I think that this and you'll appreciate this, Dan, as our CTO, but I think this is an area where machine learning and artificial intelligence
Definitely.
taking all that information along with some of the clinical information that we already know, I think there's more highlights here, or you can give better feedback as to, hey, that walking program that you started, look what it's done to your glucose curves, before and after. I think there's a lot to that, but so I think these cases I picked mainly because they had a few other things to show, and all three of them, I think you get a good sense that there's more to this than just if I eat this, do I get a spike?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, given the wealth of all this information, what types of patients benefit the most? Like, is there a certain, we talk about subtypes, something like that. Is there certain people that benefit more from having CGMs than others?
Yeah. So I think, absolutely. So, and of course we're talking about CGMs in the context of type 2 diabetes. The subtypes that are pancreatic deficient that are more like type 1, absolutely. I think if you're, LADA, which is subtype 1, or if you're subtype 2, where your pancreas just isn't really working very well, a CGM I think is essential, and you probably always should be using it. It's very hard to kind of maintain good glucose control without it. You just kind of need that extra bit of feedback.
Yeah.
Just because it doesn't take very much to have your glucose spike when your pancreas can't produce a lot of insulin. So you really want that feedback to govern what you're doing. The other thing that we see, and this is important to understand, is if your hemoglobin A1C is closer to, if it's right around, if it's in that pre-diabetic range, or 6 to 6.5, most of the glucose, most of that's actually being driven by what your fasting glucose levels are like. When we see it above 7, what we start to see is an increasing proportion of your A1C number is actually coming from the spikes that you're getting with your meals. And so because this gives us such good feedback as to what's happening with meals, I think anybody who's in that poorly controlled category, so people that are 7.5 or 8 or above, the CGM, I think, also should be essential to get that feedback as to kind of which meals work and which meals don't work. And so I think, again, it just gives you such immediate feedback that it's very helpful for people to make that change.
Okay, so I guess maybe another way to phrase that question is there someone that doesn't benefit from having the CGM?
Well, so we of course encourage people to get a CGM for at least two, wear one sensor during the 12-week program, and we usually encourage to do it around week 5 when we're talking about carbohydrates. So week 5, all carbohydrates are not created equal. There's the red light carbs, those fast ones like sugar and flour and starchy stuff that, of course, we want to get rid of. We don't really need a CGM to tell us that. The green light carbs, again, we don't really need a CGM because they're not going to cause spikes. It's those yellow light carbs. And you simply can't know what your portion is of yellow light carbs. So, I think there's always that benefit, even for somebody who's pre-diabetic, to see, are there any foods that are going to push them over? And not to test the red light carbs, just that, are they good foods that might push you over? Let's find those out. So that's why we kind of say try it. That being said, if you have a boring curve, and it was kind of fun when I was looking through, a whole bunch of people volunteered their CGMs, and they had boring curves. They literally had flat curves that their glucose was really well controlled across 24 hours, and there were no major spikes, and there was very narrow variability. When you start getting those, you probably don't need the CGM anymore, right? Because it's not telling you anything new. So I would say, people that wouldn't benefit are people that either, you try it, you get a boring curve, or if you're in the pre-diabetic, kind of early pre-diabetic phase, chances are there's going to be less to learn from the CGM than for somebody else. I always get asked this question kind of at at dinner parties and things like this is, well, I see a lot of people, health influencers, talking about wearing CGMs because the lower blood sugar control, the better. Shouldn't I wear a CGM all the time? And I kind of laugh with that because the reality is, if you think about it, what we're measuring is the glucose response, right? So if you have a healthy pancreas, you can eat a lot and not get a glucose spike. And so you can have a pretty boring curve, even if you're not eating a bunch of things that, even if you're eating a bunch of things that aren't the best for you, right? So I'm not sure what the CGM is teaching you, right? It's giving you feedback that your pancreas can handle that Coke, when you know fully well that you probably Coke's probably not the best thing for you. So,
Definitely.
So I think common sense prevails at a certain point in time. You don't need to measure everything all the time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and then any other final wrapping up comments you want to say before we finish up today?
Yeah, I'm going to plant a seed and just see what happens. I've been thinking it would be fun to do a group medical visit around CGM where we get people to kind of bring their curves or bring their reports, so we can look at their curves, and get a sense of kind of how people are interpreting it themselves, and then kind of see kind of what else we see in it as we look at that. So. If you've got a CGM or a CGM report and you want us to review your results in that group setting, just send me a direct message. You can send me a direct message on the community, or you can send it to brendan@lifestylерx.io, or you can put it in the comments. And we'll see if there's enough interest to do that. We might just try that kind of 1 or 2 times and just see what happens. I just think these things are. There's a lot to learn from, and I think the challenge for a lot of patients is just they only have their own curves to look at, right? So they're looking at their own reports and they're kind of trying to figure it out. And when you get to see lots of different reports, I think that's where you start to pick up differences and nuances, and you can start to learn a little bit more. So if people are interested, then just as I said, message me, and I'd really be happy to do that.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. That was a very interesting look into some of the data, and getting to see all that is always cool. So, thank you for putting all that together. And we will leave it at that. So, thank you all so much for listening. As always, if you know of anyone who would benefit from listening to the podcast, feel free to share the link with them, share the YouTube link, whatever you have, and hopefully you can introduce them to the podcast. If you have any questions or anything you'd like us to answer, leave them in the comments on the community post or on wherever you're listening or watching. If you were listening to the audio version, you made it this far without looking at the video version, we will leave you a link to the video to go look at all the cool graphics. So it's probably worth checking that out, and we'll leave a link to the YouTube video there in the description of wherever you're listening the audio version of. And yeah, if you're interested in the Lifestyle RX program, it's available in BC, Alberta, and Ontario. It's provincially covered, and you can sign up at lifestylерx.ca. All right, thank you so much, Brendan, and we'll talk to you next week.
Hey, thanks, Dan.